You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan, joined as always by our producer, Chelsea Steer. What is happening, Chelsea?
Well, Sarah, you know that we've been inching toward our goal of reaching 1 million food founders, our big audacious goal. And part of that growth has happened right here on YouTube.
Yes.
If you're watching on YouTube, I just want to remind you the biggest ways that you can support us and our growth as a channel, as a podcast, as creators. And that is going to be by liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with your friends, whether they're founders, fellow founders, or just people that you think will get something out of this show. And then the number one way is by subscribing to this channel. And you can do that right below the video. Make sure you turn on notifications so that you get updates anytime we release more videos like this.
Yeah, Chelsea, our quarterly update is coming very soon, and I'm really excited to share the growth that we have had over, Q1 of this year. And I want to say a quick but very meaningful thank you to everyone who has subscribed to this channel. Every week, our numbers are going up, as you said, inching toward our big, hairy, audacious goal. So thank you to everyone who has subscribed. And for those of you who haven't yet, please just take a second, hit the button. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I know that we cannot wait to celebrate that first 500 subscribers. So let's get to it. Let's get to that number.
Yeah.
Okay. What are we talking about today, Sarah?
Well, I wrote a newsletter recently about the tariffs, the impending tariffs. And in the newsletter, I really talked about what we learned from COVID and how we can take that into this current time, the sort of time of uncertainty, if you will. Because as we record this episode, it is Friday, April 11th, and the tariffs have just gone under like a 90-day pause.
Yeah.
Despite that, we see from founders who are taking to Instagram that the costs of products that they purchase are still going up. Benny Blanco Tortillas founder Christopher Hudson, who's recently on the show, he shared, I think it was the cost of bags went from like $120, let's say $2 per case, up to $160 a case between the time that like the tariffs were just about to happen and then after the pause happened. So we can't even really predict like what is going to happen day to day. And so we felt, you and I, after having a discussion, that no matter what happens specifically in regard to the tariffs, it feels like a very important time to talk about what to do in a time of economic uncertainty, both like largely in the world, but also within the food industry and within your individual business.
Yeah, I think it's something that, as you shared, right, we've both talked about, and I think is really important to continue to drive home kind of the key messages that we share and how they can have an impact on founders' bottom line.
Yeah. And I think, as I mentioned a moment ago, like I'm really appreciating the founders who are showing up in real time and sharing updates of how their costs are changing. I also really appreciate the founders who are sharing how they understand or think that the tariffs, will affect their business or how they won't and for what reasons, right? I also love the insights that other financial experts are sharing online. Even we all can have a very narrow vision of like, okay, how is this going to affect our specific industry in very direct ways? But I think no one knows exactly how the dollars and cents will land. But what we do know is that things are going to get more expensive, and it doesn't have to do like solely with physical goods, right? Tariffs and even the lack of tariffs, as we're seeing, can have an impact on everything from distribution to insurance and everything in between, right? Because it's all connected. So despite all the unknowns, despite the things we think are going to happen or that might happen, this is not a shelter in place moment. It's not about just kind of curling up and trying to survive and make it through whatever this time frame looks like.
Mm-hmm.
there is still opportunity for growth, but how you do it needs to be very strategic, and it might be very different than what you set out to achieve at the beginning of the year, and that's totally okay.
Yeah, it might feel like a bit of whiplash, as you
Mhm.
said, we're just in April. So if things are changing that quickly for you in your business, it might, it's okay to take a moment, take a breath, and then get your mindset around what that reset looks like.
Yeah.
But as you're saying, and I can't wait to hear more of what you're going to be sharing today, there are things that you can do. And yeah, it's not a moment to just hide your head in the sand.
Yeah. It's also not a moment to just keep pushing forward on a plan that may not make sense
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. I think that's even, it might even be a more important piece of advice. Yeah. Okay. Well, I cannot wait to dive into this. What do you think? We'll take a quick break and come right back.
Yeah, let's do it. I want to take a moment to thank our Baba Yacht members whose contributions have supported the continued production of the Good Food CFO podcast. Whether you are a one-time, monthly, or annual member, your contributions are helping us to grow our impact. And together, we are changing the way that food business is done. If you're listening and want to learn more about our Baba Yacht membership, how it supports this podcast and our impact, and to learn about the exclusive perks like live Q&As, member events, beta testing new tools, and more, visit thegoodfoodcfo.com/Baba Yacht. That's spelled BABOYOT. Now back to the show.
So, Sarah, as you talked about in the intro, right, of this episode, currently we're not looking at, tariffs across the board as we thought we would a couple of days ago, but we also don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? And as you very astutely pointed out, that doesn't mean that costs aren't already going up anyways,
Yeah.
right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what things founders can do to protect their business, protect their finances, and really set themselves up to, as you said, not just shelter in place, but to be able to move their business forward
Yeah. Yeah.
through this time.
So the first thing I want to say, Chelsea, is that all is not lost. What we have learned from history, recent and a little bit further back, history, is that when there is a recession or a fear of a recession or money tightens for consumers due to layoffs or fear, you know what I mean, around the future, consumers do stop making big expensive purchases, but they don't completely stop spending. The way that people treat themselves, if you will, is to spend a little bit more on the small things that they enjoy. And we see this quite often in the food space. So, I referenced COVID in the newsletter that I wrote about this topic because it was a very recent time and there are some similarities, definitely big differences, but also some similarities. And so I can look back to the data and say, what did we see happen with brands? Yes, during COVID, people were purchasing in different places. I don't know that we're going to see as much direct purchasing from brands as we did during COVID, but I do predict that people will spend a little bit more money on things like a fancy peanut butter, an artisan jam, a small batch chocolate bar, right? Better coffee at home. Maybe you used to go to Starbucks all the time, or you used to go, hopefully you'll still go to your local coffee shop, but maybe you're brewing better coffee at home now. Maybe you used to only brew really fancy coffee at home on the weekends, and now you're going to start to enjoy it 7 days a week. These little habits are things that we can look to the past and say, okay, that this has actually happened when money tightens for people. So what that means for good food brands and founders listening is that it does not, the threat of recession, threat of tariffs, it does not automatically translate into lower sales. And I strongly believe that if you know your customer,
Mm.
and you're able to speak to them, right? You can continue to speak to them and continue to serve them where they are. I think remembering that at the end of the day, we're all humans. And so how we're individually feeling, translating that into our communications as a founder, as a brand, to our customers who are likely feeling the same ways, can go a long way. But again, like, all is not lost. We don't have to assume that sales are going to drop dramatically in any specific channel or even across the board.
Yeah. And one thing that I would take away from this is if you are a founder, right, keeping an eye on your sales reports. Maybe, as you said, we're not really sure necessarily what channels might be affected, or if, somebody is going to shop in one channel versus another. And so maybe you'll see a downturn in your direct to consumer channel, but then an uptick in another, right? So I would
Yeah.
say that overall sales number, it would be an important thing to keep an eye on. But another question that I have is, is it worth at this point, would you say, investing money into how you're marketing, right? As you said, that we see that consumers tend to lean towards some of those smaller kind of treat yourself products, and that tends to be food related. I mean, I can totally relate to that myself, right? A small little treat.
Yeah.
But is there does it make sense to invest money into kind of leaning into that message at this point?
So a couple things. That's a great question. And I want to go back to the sales, right? I think it's a great idea to pay attention to your sales in each channel, because as you just mentioned, maybe we see a dip in direct to consumer sales, and maybe that's because you have to pay for shipping when you purchase online, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you sell on Amazon, for example, you don't see a dip. Maybe you see an increase. Like the outcomes can be very different for every brand. So paying attention to what is happening in these channels is absolutely something I would say, if you're not already doing, do it. Maybe like one could hypothesize that like our retail sales will go up because people are shopping where they already shop, right? But now they're grabbing that chocolate treat, for example, or that better coffee when before they didn't buy it, or they opted for something sort of less special. So I do think paying attention to where people are buying makes, like, it should absolutely be done. That bleeds into your marketing question, of course, right? Because understanding where people are shopping and where people aren't is one thing, and you're going to know your brand and your customers the best to start to think about, do I need to run promotions or marketing in some way to help
Mm-hmm.
continue to drive sales? But that takes me to the second item on my list, actually, which is costs will go up. And we're already seeing that even with the just the threat of the tariffs, the cost of things were starting to go up. As we're recording, as we said in the intro, it's April 11th. A 90-day pause has happened on many of the tariffs that were going to go into place. After that announcement was made, costs have gone up even further for some items
Yeah.
for founders. So we know that costs are going to go up. We don't know how high, right? And we don't know the rhythm or the reasoning behind it as far as our inputs go. This is going to drive up our cost of goods sold. This could potentially drive up the cost to distribute, right? Freight costs, things of that nature. That is going to potentially shrink your profit margins.
Yeah.
And in the intro where we talked about, your plan at the beginning of the year might have been one thing, and now it might need to be something completely different. I think that will be based on what are the purchasing trends of my customers that I'm keeping an eye on, and also how are these changes affecting my margin. I will share that I work with a brand that at the beginning of the year, we had created a growth plan. We had COGS of a certain number, and we were going into retail. It's a brand that is distributing through both large and regional distributors, and they had a distribution focused growth plan.
Mm-hmm.
Things have already changed significantly for them. And the conversations over the last 2 to 3 weeks have been, what is your comfortability with debt? Because if we stay on this original path, this original plan, the amount of debt needed is going to be much greater. Should we be shifting already our focus to a more D2C and wholesale direct, growth plan, because the margins
Mm-hmm.
are greater there? So, do we want to stay even closer to home than we thought we were going to at the beginning of the year? How do we bring together our marketing team, our ads team, our broker team to make sure that we are all on the same page and that we all understand the criteria
Yeah.
for saying yes to a new retailer, to saying, or to saying yes to spending money on online ads to drive those D2C sales? So the decisions are going to, people don't like it when I say this. We've actually gotten comments on, I think, YouTube in particular, and like into our Instagram DMs. They don't like it when I say it's going to depend on what is happening on your business, in your business. But these are the things you have to be looking at, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at, if this brand continues to push in distribution, they are going to have massive negative gross profit margins in the channel if they're doing promos, if they're doing ads, if they're doing the things that stores are requiring of them. If we're able to onboard with people who aren't requiring those things, okay, we've got a chance. So now we're analyzing, it's too expensive. It's too cash intensive, debt intensive to onboard with stores right now that have free fills, slotting fees, things of that nature. So we're looking at the numbers and we're saying, no, instead of growing doors, we're going to grow velocity in the doors we are already in. That's not a bad strategy no matter what, right?
Yeah.
We're also going to look to growing that D2C channel, and we're going to test out and perform, or sorry, we're going to test the performance of ads. So far in this particular case, they're doing well. And that
Mm.
has to do with, the branding and the messaging and all of that. So we may lean into that. So if your margins are high in distribution and you can still grow there and not have it be a massive impact like the brand I'm describing, then you may choose to continue doing it. What every brand should be doing is running the numbers.
Knowing. Yeah.
Because while it's not a shelter in place time, it's a, do I need to pivot my plan? Do I need to, no matter what, you're making investments in growth, whether in this case it's distribution or D2C, which one has the greater potential ROI and the least negatively impactful outcome if it doesn't go as planned?
Yeah. I mean, the number one thing you made me think of as you were talking through this and telling that story about your client was like, if I'm a founder right now, today on April 11th, I'm putting out a company wide memo that we are not signing any contracts. We're not going into any distribution like until we've fully reviewed what is going to be required of us,
Yeah.
what we're going to, have to invest in that channel.
And determining what is the threshold, I
Yeah.
think, is really important too, right? Because, is there an opportunity? There's lots of like, I think KeHE has the like a local at KeHE or like new at KeHE kind of thing, where there's opportunities that are very different than if you're just entering KeHE the typical way.
Mm-hmm.
Whole Foods / Amazon has in their stores the local foraging path, right? Which doesn't have the onboarding cost that going into Whole Foods the typical way does, right? So you can take advantage of those things. It's also a great time and opportunity to, as I said, drive velocity in the locations you're already at, because then when you're ready to start opening new doors, you've got that data. You have performance
Mm-hmm.
information, which gives you more leverage when it comes time to negotiate. If you're a young brand or you don't have a ton of data that you can bring to them and say, listen, people want this product, we're going to make you money, it's much harder to negotiate those fees and costs away. Here's the other reality that I think needs to be said out loud here. We know that Albertsons, for example, has sent out, I'll call it a memo, to their brand saying that they will not accept price increases due to tariffs. Except with like, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's like, certain circumstances, like, could be allowed. So we don't know, are those certain circumstances like the coffee industry, the chocolate industry, that regardless of tariffs, costs are going up, but they're already dictating that they are not going to change their price on shelf. They are not going to pay any more for a brand's product. I shouldn't say that they're not going to increase the price on shelf. They might. So don't erase that from your minds, right? They may increase the price on shelf, but they are not going to increase the price that they are paying to brands, regardless of the fact that with 99.9% certainty, the costs for all brands' products are going to go up. Once again, an example of the industry like not being in support of small brands and really being in it for themselves. But, that's the reality we're living in.
I don't love to hear that. As you've already said, Sarah, like running the numbers, right? And any opportunity that you may be thinking about entering, really understanding the true cost to your business. What else should a founder be thinking about, in this sense, as we go through these uncertain times?
Yeah, I think something that has to happen is paying attention to the cost of your inputs. And, I think I talk about this in an upcoming episode, perhaps, that it's very common for brands to sort of look at their cost of inputs when they're creating a new product. And maybe they look at them once a year. Oftentimes people don't look at them again, and they feel like they have a sense of, how much their costs are going up. But really pay attention to what is the cost of my bags today versus the last time I ordered them.
Yeah.
And with specificity, how is that impacting the unit cost of my product? And determine if a price increase makes sense for your brand and your customers, and at what point that increase would need to be made. So for example, let's say you're at a 60% margin right now, and you know that in your business, you can't go below a 55% gross product margin, or product gross profit margin, I should say. Then as you're watching the numbers, if you get to 58, if you get to 57, if you get to 56, you might say, we got to pull the trigger on this because it's going to take time to roll out this change. Or you might say, I'm going to allow it to drop below 55, but if it hangs there for X amount of time, then I'm going to increase the price. I think it's good to sort of set an intention, set a guardrail, and then pay attention to the data, because we need your brand to survive these uncertain times. And there's a lot of conversation around, will brands raise their prices? Will they not? Will they absorb the cost? Can lower cost products not, lower priced products, I should say, not increase their prices, but a premium product could, because of who's buying that? But there's like so much conversation around that on the internet, for example. The only thing I think of when I hear that conversation is, can the brand survive not increasing their prices? If they don't want to increase their price, or they can't because of who their consumer is and how they're positioned in the market, then what can they do?
Yeah.
Is it their channel strategy? Is it, which products they're selling to whom and where? Like, what can you do to protect yourself? Because again, while it's not a shelter in place, we have to be really open-minded and thinking about, how do I move through this so I can still be successful, not just surviving, but thriving on the other side of this. That leads me to the third thing on the list, which is cash is queen, as I like to say, right? We know that businesses that have cash on hand are better positioned to weather economic storms.
Yeah.
And the longer your cash can last, right? That cash runway, right? The better. So if you've been listening to the podcast for any amount of time, you know that cash on hand, cash runway is directly related to the margins of your products and the gross profit margin of your business. So it starts with your product margins, knowing your COGS, keeping an eye on that. It extends to where are we selling our product? What are the margins in that channel? How are things changing? And will result in how much cash you have in your business.
Mm-hmm.
At this point in time, the amount of cash that you have is potentially going to be telling in terms of how any potential economic downturn, increase in costs, effects in sales are going to impact your business and its longevity.
Yeah, I would say, I think that this is something that we've talked about many, many times before, right? And how important cash is to the business. But I think that the point that you're making here, and I think is a very, very important point, is that in times like we find ourselves in now, that is only highlighted, bolder,
Yep.
bigger, more important.
Yeah. I think you should always have somewhat of a cash focused approach to your business, meaning how do we conserve our cash? How do we grow our cash, right? While still growing our business. Owning a business, running a business is inherently risky. I am never suggesting that you don't take risks, right? But cash is queen. We need cash, especially in times where margins may be decreasing, where sales may be affected, right? In different channels, right? If your D2C reduces, but your retail through distributors grows, that is great because that overall sales are and units are staying steady, but the margins are going to be quite different.
Yeah.
Right? That percentage of sales and where those sales are coming from will have an effect on your overall gross profit margin and your cash.
And I would also say when we're talking about cash in your business, right? And the more cash that you have in your business, the more likely that you are not just to survive, right, but to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we do find ourselves in times like this, in economic, climates like this, taking on debt, right, taking on financing only becomes more expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. It's currently quite expensive. And yes, it definitely could get more expensive for sure. And we also know that there are predatory lenders in the industry, right? I think we talked about it in a recent episode with Christopher Hudson, again, bringing him up, but Shopify loans, Stripe loans, like things of that nature, they're easy to get because they come with a high price tag. I think taking a cash approach can look lots of different ways, a cash focused approach. Like, for example, don't tie up too much cash in inventory, right? Looking at things through a slightly different lens. You might buy inventory in a certain volume typically, right? But if that's going to tie up more cash than you feel comfortable with now, maybe you take a couple point hit in your profit margin on your products because it leaves you cash in the bank, right, to help operate your business. Only spend on necessities for operating and growing the business, right? That goes back to reevaluating. Is the growth plan we had in place in January, does it still make sense for us now, since the numbers may have changed, right? Or because just things are changing? What can you do differently so you're not sticking your head in the sand and just driving forward, but you're really paying attention to everything that's going on? And the last thing I'll say is keep an eye on accounts receivable and get your cash on time. Chelsea, you know that we have got clients that have tens of thousands of dollars outstanding in accounts receivable. And interestingly, much of that is because distributors will take a really long time to pay.
Yeah.
And that can also impact your strategy, right? If you're working with distributors and you're putting out product and suddenly it's taking you 90 days to get cash from them as
Or
opposed
more.
to 30 or more, that's not a cash optimized
Yeah.
sales strategy, right? Like so even thinking through those types of things. So, I mean, I'm laying out a lot here, but I think the overarching message is think about the direction that you're driving your business in. Look at the information, the numbers, the things that are changing. And I guess I'm giving permission, not that you need it, but just in case, to change
Yeah.
the focus, to change what you're doing so that you can be successful in what we call uncertain times, right? Where a lot feels out of our control and a lot is out of our control.
Yeah. And I think it's so important again to frame what you're saying as, yeah, being okay to change the plan,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not a retreat, not a failure, not a, oh, that didn't work out like we thought it was going to.
Yep.
When you can frame it as, I'm going to look at my numbers, I'm going to understand where I'm at with my business, and then I'm going to make an informed choice on what is best for my business, that is empowering.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing. That's
Yeah.
not a defeat. That's not a bad change, or, that
Mm-hmm.
is taking control.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, Chelsea, it might be a good time to just shout out some of the tools that we have that can help people
Yeah.
with this process. So we talk about product margins a lot. Our perfect pricing calculator is designed to help with this. So if you've got, changing costs, you can plug your new product costs into the perfect pricing calculator. You can determine, okay, what are my margins going to be changing to in distribution or my wholesale direct relationships or my, D2C relationships. Maybe you are selling on Amazon or Bubble Goods or, Mabel and Fair. We also have calculators for those sites and tools as well. So you can just run the numbers and see very clearly for all of your products, how are things changing or where you're at, as close to real time as humanly possible. I think the cash flow manager or cash flow projector, which is a $15 tool, is extremely helpful for just laying the cash out there, seeing how long it can last as of today, right? And ideating around what can I do to make it last longer, or what can I do to get more cash in the business, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
to protect myself at this point in time. And then lastly, a tool that we love is that profit assessment. That's a bigger picture view of the business that can help you understand your overall, blended gross profit margin, what levers you can pull within the business to increase that percentage, to increase your cash flow, right? There's a great, I always forget the word, but there's a great chart, decision tree
Yes.
that, based on your numbers, we walk you through it so that you can take actionable steps. We make these tools to help make food business finance easier to understand, easier to execute. So we hope that you'll visit our website, take advantage of those tools if you haven't already. And it feels like a wild time.
Yeah.
I don't want it to feel like a negative downer time. I want people to feel empowered and to truly be empowered in
Yeah.
their businesses.
And I want to shout out that all of those tools, again, are priced under $200.
Yeah. And I want to say also, like, reach out to us via email, hello@thegoodfoodcfo.com. Hop into our DMs on Instagram, comment on YouTube. Like, we want to hear from you. We say this a lot now here on the podcast, but we're creating this content for you.
Yeah.
So if you need help around a particular topic, if you've got something going on in your business, send us an email. We read everything. We start developing episodes around the questions and concerns that we get in the inbox. It may not be immediate, but it is coming. We do this to help our listeners, and that is what brings us joy. It's what lights us up. It is why we do this. So, if you can't get into office hours, if you're unable to get those tools, or you've already got those tools, but you need a little something, communicate with us. Like, we're here for you. It doesn't have to be a paid transaction. And when you ask a question to us via email and we can talk about it here on the podcast, we're helping a lot of people. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And I'll reiterate again, right? That email is hello@thegoodfoodcfo.com. As you said, Sarah, we'd love to hear from you there. So please do reach out. or wherever you might be connected with us, right? Sarah, that's the end of our time today. I want to thank you as always for being our, leader through these conversations, our thought leader, and helping us to, as we like to say, make food business finances easier.
Chelsea, it's my pleasure.
Looking for more content like this? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see weekly podcast episodes as well as other content related to the show. Just visit youtube.com/@thegoodfoodcfo.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.